Discoveries of a Lifetime. Bible truths confirmed through archaeology with Dr. Mark Finley and Dr. Michael Hasel.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us again in Discoveries of a Lifetime, a journey through the ancient lands of the Bible to discover a meaning and purpose in life. As we've traveled to Egypt and Babylon already in this series, we've learned that the teachings of the Bible, the places, the people of the Bible, are really confirmed through discoveries in archaeology. No, archaeology does not absolutely prove without a shadow of a doubt that the Bible is true, but it does help to confirm its authenticity. Dr. Michael Hasel and I are co-hosting this series together. Dr. Hasel is a director of the Institute of Archaeology at Southern Adventist University, also a professor of archaeology and Near East studies there. Dr. Hasel has spent many, many years in the field excavating a number of varied sites in the Bible lands. And Dr. Hasel, I know that as we've traveled together, you and I did a shoot some time ago, actually in Jericho.
That's correct.
It was an enjoyable time together, and we'll travel to Jericho in one of the upcoming programs and take a look at some of the discoveries there that help to confirm that the walls of Jericho fell down exactly like the Bible said. As an archaeologist, can you think of one or two finds that really have impressed you with the truthfulness of the Bible? Maybe some of the things that are in our upcoming programs that will encourage our viewers to watch.
There's a couple of things I think that are very exciting. I think probably the most exciting discovery ever made were the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to talk about that when we deal with the Da Vinci Code and some of the claims that are made in the Da Vinci Code regarding the Bible. But the Dead Sea Scrolls found in 1947 were probably the most significant find. Here you had all of the biblical books of the Bible, with the possible exception of Esther, in a corpus of material found at the Dead Sea, and which showed the accuracy of the Bible going all the way back 1,000 years before our earliest manuscripts.
That was really an exciting find. Another find that we will be talking about is actually the name of David in the Stela of David.
That's right.
That was found whereabouts?
That was found in the northernmost site, right on the Lebanese border, the site of Tel Dan, back in 1993. Avraham Biran was working there with a group of students from the Hebrew Union College, and one of the volunteers turned over a stone in one of the walls there right outside the city gate, and lo and behold, here was a fragment of a large stela commemorating the victory against the house of David and the house of Israel, the first time we have a mention of David outside the Bible.
We'll be talking about those things, actually showing the graphics of these varying sites in upcoming programs. So stay with us throughout this series. This may be the first time that you are viewing this program today, but stay with us as we journey through the Bible and the lands of the Bible for some of these amazing archaeological finds. In our program today, we travel to Nebuchadnezzar's capital, Babylon. You remember that in our last program, we introduced the subject of Babylon. We pointed out that Babylon is in the country of Iraq. Modern-day Iraq was composed of ancient Babylon. Baghdad, of course, is the capital of Iraq today. It's in the midst of a civil war filled with chaos. But in the days of the Bible, the capital was not Baghdad, but it was south of that in the city of Babylon. Saddam had a sense of destiny. He believed he was to become the Middle East's new Nebuchadnezzar. Just as Nebuchadnezzar ruled ancient Babylon, so Saddam today wanted to see his nation, his empire, as the leading empire in the entire Middle East. This is a really fascinating billboard. It's a recent photograph that has come out of Iraq. You'll notice in the foreground you see Saddam Hussein. In the background you see Nebuchadnezzar on his chariot as the ruler of Babylon, ruler of the Middle East, galloping across the Middle Eastern deserts. Nebuchadnezzar and Saddam had some things in common. Saddam, just like Nebuchadnezzar, wanted to dominate. He wanted to rule. He wanted to be the one that was the chief of all the Middle East. He set forth his goal to accomplish that, of course, by invading Kuwait, and he set forth his goal to accomplish that in attempting earlier in the Iran-Iraq war to dominate Iran. He wanted to dominate the entire Middle East. If you look at the old Babylonian Empire, and if you look at Iraq today, the Babylonian Empire spread throughout what we now know as Turkey. It went over to the area that we know as, went up into Syria, went down into the area of Israel as they attacked and overcame Israel, went over into the area of Iran. So the Babylonian Empire really was a major empire in the Middle East. If you go to the ancient site of Babylon, south of Baghdad today, you'll notice that it's largely composed of ruins. The Babylonians ruled from 605 BC to 539. But what happened to that ancient empire? Where did the empire of Babylon go? And what lessons do we have from ancient Babylon that relate to Iraq and modern Babylon today? What similarities are there between the demise of Nebuchadnezzar and the demise of Saddam Hussein? What attitudes are the same between the two men? What ambitions are the same between the two men? And what caused the fall of either of those men? Well, let's go back and look at Nebuchadnezzar, and then we'll come back to modern-day Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Babylon was founded after the flood as the center of the kingdom of Nimrod. Now remember, the Bible teaches in the book of Genesis, in the days of Noah, that the world was destroyed by a flood. We've pointed out that there are flood traditions or flood stories outside the Bible in things like the Gilgamesh epic. You have the creation story and also the flood story. Although there are differences between those stories, there are similarities of flood stories all over the world. There are flood stories today among ancient tribes that have not been exposed to written language. These flood stories reveal that indeed the world was destroyed by a flood. In the days after the flood, in the kingdom of Nimrod, there was a tower that was built. We know it as the Tower of Babel, found in Genesis, the 11th chapter. The builders of that tower built the tower because they believed that if God would destroy the world with a flood again, they would be protected from that flood. Scholars believe that the site of ancient Babylon was on the site of the Tower of Babel, as the builders were building the Tower of Babel in defiance and rebellion against God, a man-made protection system. God confused the languages, and as he did, they couldn't continue the building, and so they were in chaos, and they were scattered to various parts of the earth. Babel, the Tower of Babel. Why do you call a baby, B-A-B-Y? Well, a baby babbles. A baby is confused in its speech. So when you think of the Tower of Babel, you're thinking of confusion in the area of religious thought. You're thinking of rebellion against God. You're thinking of a place where man exalts his authority above God's authority. That Tower of Babel formed the foundation or the roots of ancient Babylon. What do we know about Babylon today? What does archaeology reveal about Babylon? Claudius Rich, the English archaeologist, began his excavation of Babylon in 1817. And from about 1817, for almost 100 years, on and off, intermittently, and sometimes pretty regularly, Babylon was excavated. The ruins of Babylon were fairly well preserved underneath the initial levels. Scores of clay tablets and cylinders were found there in Babylon. Austin Henry Layard excavated Babylon briefly in 1850. Now, why do we say briefly? Layard was an English archaeologist. He really wanted to excavate Nineveh, and he didn't have as much interest in Babylon, although Babylon is a site that now has demanded worldwide attention. It was Robert Koldewey, the German archaeologist, that did the best work at the site in Babylon. He began his excavations in 1899 and continued them until just before the First World War. He excavated the Ishtar Gate, and there on the left-hand side of the picture you see just the beginnings of this photograph. It's an amazing photograph of, you see how they put the railway tracks in and how they took trainloads away, carloads away of refuse and debris. They've just began to do here excavate the Ishtar Gate. We'll show you pictures of that later. That has been reconstructed in the Pergamum Museum in what was known as East Germany, but now is all part of Germany. The excavators discovered, the archaeologists discovered, the size of this ancient city of Babylon. The circumference of Babylon was about 10 miles. Now, Nineveh was 7.5 miles in circumference. Rome was 6 miles in circumference. Athens, 4 miles. Look at Babylon. It was 2.5 times the size of Athens. It was bigger, 40% bigger than Rome, and it was bigger than Nineveh. Babylon was an amazing city, the capital of the then known world. Babylon had over a 20-year food supply in it, as we pointed out in our last program. The river Euphrates ran through the center of it. So Babylon was a city of affluence, a city of splendor, a city of wealth, a city of pomp, a city of military might. The river Euphrates provided it a lushness, and so you had the hanging gardens of Babylon, and inside that city, marvelous temples and constant water and irrigation supply because of the river Euphrates. Babylon had walls that were 200 feet high, and here you see some of the images on the walls. Beautiful in its day, blue tiled and glazed walls, marvelous artistry off the walls of Babylon. The walls around the city were pierced with 8 gates, and of course this gate is the Ishtar Gate, that you can see a reconstruction of that, as we mentioned, in the Pergamum Museum today. It was the most important of all gates. You might be interested in knowing that when the German archaeologists, with their mathematical precision, uncovered the Ishtar Gate, and when Koldewey did that, he had the tiles steamed off the walls. He took very accurate, precise mathematical measurements of the walls. He went back and built a replica of the Ishtar Gate, but he put the exact tiles on the walls in the Pergamum Museum. And so I remember visiting the Pergamum Museum a number of years ago. Actually, I was there at the same time that Dr. Hasel's father was there, Dr. Hasel Sr., and we went through the gates together and just were amazed again to think that Daniel could have walked through these very gates, to think about Nebuchadnezzar and all his pomp walking through these gates. It really gives you a sense of aura and history, and it gives you a sense of the past when you stand at the Ishtar Gate in the Pergamum Museum. This is Procession Way that would have gone through the Ishtar Gate, and Procession Way, of course, is rebuilt in the Pergamum Museum in East Germany today, based on Koldewey's findings. The book of Daniel speaks about Babylon as a symbol of a winged lion. And it talks about, in Daniel chapter 7, the great vision of Daniel 7, it describes Babylon as a lion with eagle's wings. The reason for that, of course, is that you have Babylon symbolized as a lion on the Ishtar Gate. And if you'll notice, coming down off the mane of the lion, you'll notice there is a wing that comes out here, and that wing, of course, is like the eagle's wing. So on the very walls of Babylon, you have the symbol that's so aptly mentioned in the Bible, so accurately mentioned in the Bible, so precisely mentioned in the Bible, a lion with eagle's wings. Indeed, the Bible prophecies and the Bible symbolism is confirmed in ancient archaeology today. Daniel chapter 7, verse 4 says, speaking of the beasts, the first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. We've just seen that on the walls of Babylon. This is an amazing picture. You notice on the right-hand side, the soldiers, the American soldiers. One of the medical officers that was visiting this site of ancient Babylon took these pictures and provided them for us. And you see again a lion animal-like symbol representing Babylon there today in the city of ancient Babylon. At the New Year festival, the great Lord Marduk was carried along the sacred way and enshrined in the temple. And here is the uncovering, the archaeological uncovering of Procession Way as it led through the Ishtar Gate. Babylon had over 200 pagan temples. The chief of those pagan temples, of course, the chief temple, was a temple to Bel Marduk. in gratitude to the Babylonian gods, Nebuchadnezzar built no fewer than 53 temples, 955 sanctuaries, and 384 altars. Nebuchadnezzar believed that his power, Nebuchadnezzar believed that his strength, Nebuchadnezzar believed that his world-conquering ability came from the gods of Babylon, not the God that created heavens and the earth, not the God of the Bible, not the God who was Lord over all. Nebuchadnezzar, in his pride and in his arrogance, cried out that he was the builder of Babylon. The ziggurat was made of 58 million bricks. It was a temple to the great god of Babylon, Bel-Marduk. Inside was a golden statue of Bel-Marduk weighing 800 talents or 4,000 pounds. So here is the center of Babylon. Here's the epitome of what Babylon stands for. The essence of Babylon's greatness is represented in this great ziggurat. The temple of Bel-Marduk, the sun god, was the center of Babylon. Any nation, any society that builds temples to its gods and turns from the God of heaven has a limited span and a limited lifetime. Bel-Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians, was the essence of Nebuchadnezzar's existence. Daniel, the 4th chapter, and the 30th verse puts it this way: "Is not this great Babylon that I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty?" This was the cry of Nebuchadnezzar, crying out, "This is Babylon that I have built in arrogance and pride." But Dr. Hasel, something was to happen to this Nebuchadnezzar that cried out in arrogance and pride. Tell us the story of what actually happened to Nebuchadnezzar, the story of his downfall, and how that fits in with the ancient archaeological ruins of Babylon and modern-day discoveries.
You know, when we look at ancient Babylon and we look at this particular claim in history, in our previous program we described that Babylon was an ancient city, that Babylon had in fact existed for hundreds, even over 1,000 years prior to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, that a king by the name of Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, had already 1,200 years earlier built up a huge kingdom with Babylon as its capital. So scholars prior to the 1800s questioned this particular verse of the Bible with some disdain. After all, how could Nebuchadnezzar claim to have built Babylon when Babylon had been in existence for over 1,000 years? It's kind of like Mayor Daley of Chicago or the mayor of New York saying, "Is this not great New York that I've built for my power and majesty?" when that city has been around for at least 200 years. Maybe a couple of permits were issued and so forth, but certainly that claim couldn't be made. How could Nebuchadnezzar make this claim about ancient Babylon? Well, the fact of the matter is that when archaeologists began working at the site, archaeologists like Robert Koldewey and the Germans, they began discovering the ancient bricks of Babylon. Literally thousands of bricks that built the temple of the ziggurat, that built the walls of the city. And on these bricks, on thousands of them, they found stamped in clay an inscription that is as real today as it was in ancient Babylon. The rock record reveals that Nebuchadnezzar was the builder of Babylon because the inscription says so. You know, as kids, we used to always get into arguments sometimes about what belonged to us and what belonged to them. And I remember my mother always used to tell us, well, does it have your name written on it? These bricks had the name written on it. Nebuchadnezzar wanted every single person for posterity in his time and for posterity to come to know that he indeed was the builder of this great city. You know, Mark, today we have one of the actual bricks from Babylon here with us. Do you mind bringing that over here, this precious...
You know, I handle it almost sacredly, Dr. Hasel. Tell us about this brick. How old would this brick be?
This brick actually dates back to the time of Nebuchadnezzar. This is not a replica. This is the real thing. This comes from ancient Babylon. We're talking about 2,000 2,600 years old.
It is amazing how something like that could be preserved for 2,600 years.
Well, it was preserved primarily because clay is such a wonderful material that once it's fired, it lasts forever almost.
Now, how do we know that this isn't just some piece of clay that was lying around in the deserts of Babylon? And how do we know that it's 2,600 years old? How do we know that it has anything to do with Nebuchadnezzar?
Well, it's right here on the cover. I mean, if you'd see it like this, you'd just think it was a lump of clay on the side of the road. But when you turn it over, right here, and this is just a portion of one that would be about 1 by 1 foot square, and right in the center of it, as we see on the screen behind us, you would have this stamp right in the center of it. And here we have the corner of the stamp. This symbol here is the dinger symbol in cuneiform, which specifies king. And then we have the beginning of the name Nebuchadnezzar right here on this brick. The complete inscription reads, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, builder of Esagila, one of the temples, builder of Azega, another temple, ruler of Babylon, son of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. That's the full inscription.
How many of these bricks would have Nebuchadnezzar's name on them?
Thousands upon thousands. In fact, the Iraqis today have robbed out the ancient site of Babylon, and we've got homes all the way up the Euphrates River, north and south, using Nebuchadnezzar's bricks with this stamp on them.
That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Sure, sure. So here we can see on these bricks, thousands of them, stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, that undoubtedly Nebuchadnezzar was indeed the builder of the city of Babylon. How could this be? Well, the Assyrians, we know from records that have also been discovered by Henry Austin Layard in Nineveh, the Assyrians destroyed Babylon and razed it to the ground. The new kings, under the new Chaldean kings, under Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's father, and Nebuchadnezzar, began the rebuilding process and rebuilt Babylon to a splendor unlike anything that had come before. Now, today when you visit Babylon, this is a shot that was just taken in 2003 again. Today when you visit Babylon, you will find, as you go down below, on the earliest bricks closest to the foundation and even below the foundation, you will find bricks stamped with Hammurabi's name. Hammurabi, the king who established Babylon as a capital around 1792 BC. But then, over 1,200 years later, you have Nebuchadnezzar, his stamps. On the upper middle courses, you'll find his bricks stamped with his name. And amazingly enough, as we've already discussed, Saddam Hussein, who claimed to be the modern Nebuchadnezzar, who claimed to want to rebuild Babylon to its original boundaries and original dimensions, he has his rebuilding. Those bricks that we see up on top there have Saddam Hussein's stamp right on them. But was this city to be ever rebuilt? Was this city ever supposed to be inhabited again? What was the history of this site? We find the Bible is verified through archaeology, that the biblical record of Daniel, chapter 4, verse 30, that Daniel indeed correctly wrote down the history of this city. Nebuchadnezzar was its builder, and over time, that city would also come to destruction. For decades, scholars believed that Semiramis built Babylon. For decades, scholars believed that Nebuchadnezzar could not have been the builder of this city. But now we have clear evidence that Nebuchadnezzar's statement, "Is this not great Babylon that I have built for my great power and majesty?" This statement that appeared to be myth now ends up being the truth. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, we know also, according to the Bible, attacked Jerusalem 3 times. In 605 BC, he came and he besieged the city, and he took away all the gold vessels that Solomon had placed in the temple. He took those with him back to Babylon, along with Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In 597, he came back a second time. He took 10,000 captives with him into captivity, and along with him on that particular campaign went Ezekiel, the famous prophet, for which we have a book also in the Old Testament. So Ezekiel and Daniel accompany God's people into exile for 70 years in Babylon. Finally, in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes a third time to the city of Jerusalem, and on that particular occasion, he destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple that Solomon had built, destroys the walls of the city, and takes further captives off to captivity. According to the Babylonian Chronicle, which describes Nebuchadnezzar's attack on Jerusalem, we find that it claims he besieged the city of Judah, capturing the city on the second day in the month of Adar. He seized the king and appointed there a ruler of his own choice. He took away heavy tribute and sent it off to Babylon. This text, found among the Babylonian archives, the Babylonian Chronicles, this text confirms the biblical account that Nebuchadnezzar came to take the capital of Judah. One of the most amazing predictions in the Old Testament is found in the book of Daniel. There we find that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He has a dream that he cannot remember and that he cannot interpret. So he calls the magicians and he calls the wise men of Babylon, the most educated people in his realm, into the city. And he says, I can't remember this dream. I can't remember what I dreamed. Can someone tell me the dream and tell me the interpretation? And the magicians, they stall. The sorcerers, the wise men, they can't tell the king his dream. In fact, they tell him that no one could tell the king his dream except the gods themselves. The king is so angry he wants to put everyone to death. But Daniel and his three friends, trained in the University of Babylon, were faithful to God, and they came together in prayer. And as they prayed before the king, as they prayed before the God of heaven, to give them the interpretation of the dream, God reveals to Daniel the interpretation. And he goes to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, O king, may you live forever. No man can tell you the interpretation of the dream, but the God of heaven has revealed to you the interpretation of this dream. And he tells him what the dream was. He tells him about an image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, an image with the head of gold, and arms and chest of silver, with thighs of brass or bronze, with legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. And as he describes this image, he describes that each of these represent kingdoms, the head of gold representing Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then the thighs, Greece, and the legs of iron, Rome. And he describes this stone that was cut out without hands that came and smites the image, everything into powder. And he describes this image to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, I can imagine him on the edge of his seat listening as he recounts the dream to him. And he says, you, O Nebuchadnezzar, are that head of gold. Babylon represents the head of gold. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't want to just be the head of gold. He takes matters into his own hands, and a few years later, he erects on the plain of Dura an image out of solid gold representing his kingdom. A kingdom that will last forever. The image is clear that Babylon will last forever and that Nebuchadnezzar would rule and his descendants rule after him forever. But 3 young men were on that plain of Dura that day, refusing to bow down to the image. Daniel, we don't know where he was, if he was on some mission somewhere else in Babylon or if he was ill that day. We don't know where Daniel was, but the Bible describes in Daniel chapter 3, 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's 3 companions. There they are. They refuse to bow down to the image, and as a result of that are cast into the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar, in his later inscription, says, O Babylon, the delight of mine eyes, the excellency of the kingdoms, may it last forever. Nebuchadnezzar believed that his kingdom would last forever. He even defied the dream that God had given him, saying that his kingdom would be a kingdom that would not end. But Nebuchadnezzar was wrong. In Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 37, another contemporary of Daniel and Ezekiel, living in the land of Judah during the captivity, wrote during the same time period Babylon will be a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, an object of horror and scorn, a place where no one lives. Babylon, he said, would no longer be inhabited. Thus Babylon shall sink and not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon her. A rumor will come 1 year, and after that, in another year, a rumor will come and violence in the land, ruler against ruler. Ruins of Babylon. Today, all that is left in Babylon is ruins. Yes, Saddam Hussein built a palace outside the city walls. Yes, Saddam Hussein had plans to rebuild Babylon to a magnificence once again, but he was never able to finish and accomplish his goals. Today, Babylon lies in ruins. And as our friend who was there during the conflict in 2003 and took many of these pictures described it as he was in charge of all the military operations in the southern part of Iraq. Dr. Mary told us, he says, you know what? He says, I slept in the palace of Saddam Hussein right outside the city walls, and at night I heard the jackals howling within the city. Prophecy came to pass. How did such a mighty city fall? How did a place like Babylon cease to exist? A city that had existed for hundreds of years, even over 1,000 years. Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, predicts the fall of Babylon 150 years before the city was to fall. In Isaiah 44, verse 28, it says, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple, thy foundation shall be laid. Cyrus here in this particular passage is predicted as the destroyer of the city of Babylon and one who would usher in the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. In chapter 45, thus saith the Lord to his anointed. The word Mashiach is used here for Cyrus. Messiah is used here for Cyrus in Hebrew. To Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and who will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two gates, and the gates shall not be shut. Cyrus? How could someone named Cyrus 150 years before his time to be the deliverer of Babylon? Prophecy is able to do that. God is able to do that through his word and through communication with his prophets. Certainly, he predicted here in this chapter the specific method of attack. And so the Euphrates River, which flowed through the city, gave Babylon a sense of security. It gave Babylon a sense of perpetual water to supply its inhabitants with the most basic necessity for life. Babylon had a 20-year food supply. They were secure, happy, content, and yet to the east of them, a major empire was building up as Cyrus began to unite the Persians and the Medes and build up a whole new empire on that side of the area. In the Cyrus cylinder, which today is in the British Museum, we find the tale of the destruction and the final defeat of this ancient city of Babylon. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus planned to march on the Babylonian kingdom and on Babylon and specifically in the spring, but that one of his sacred horses drowned in the river, and seeing this as a negative omen, he decided to order his armies to stop. They dug 360 channels and spread the river out over the plain, diverting the river away from the city of Babylon. And on that night, in October 539 BC, the destruction was destined to take place the following year in 539 BC, with the city's water supply diverted. And on one fateful night, as recorded in Daniel chapter 5, we find that the king of Babylon, Belshazzar, is holding a wonderful feast. Well, wonderful for the Babylonians. It was a drunken feast, a feast where Belshazzar brings out the golden vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken with him when he took over Jerusalem on that first campaign in 605. He brought out those vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, and he was drinking from them and making fun of the God that these vessels were made for originally. And as he was going about his his evening activities, suddenly handwriting appeared on the wall behind where he was having his party, in the same room where he was having his party. And there, fate and the declaration of what was to happen to Babylon was written out. That very night, Cyrus was about to enter into the city. He entered into a dry riverbed after the Euphrates River had been diverted, and without a single fight, that night, Belshazzar was killed. Babylon came into the control of the Medo-Persian Empire, and Babylon was no more. What an incredible story, and an incredible event in history, foretold in Scripture hundreds of years before the event. Certainly prophecy was a major, major part in this event in history.
You know, Dr. Hasel, this is one of my favorite prophecies in all the Bible. To think that Cyrus is named 150 years before he's born, and that Cyrus fulfills his destiny. He is the one who attacks Babylon and overthrows it. To think as well that the Bible teaches that Cyrus would divert the Euphrates River. It says in Isaiah 44, last part, verse 27 and 28, and Isaiah 45:1, that the riverbed would be dry. That exactly happened like it's predicted. And then to think that all of this would be quantified and all of this verified on the Cyrus cylinder, indicating there on that Cyrus cylinder that Cyrus was the one that attacked Babylon,
That's right.
that he was the one that overthrew it, is just really amazing. One of the unique experiences in my life was a time when I gave a lecture series in the Kremlin, in the former Soviet Union. It was just after the fall of communism. The Yeltsin government allowed me to give a lecture in the Kremlin. And I spoke there for about 11 nights on the truthfulness of the Bible. And I remember speaking on one night on Babylon, its fall, and the prophecies that related to that fall that we have looked at today with our audience and that you've so clearly brought out. And when we talked about these prophecies, we had 2 sessions a night in the Kremlin. There were approximately 6,500 people at each session, 13,000 people a night. It was an amazing time. Between the sessions, a large Russian general came to speak to me. He must have been, 6'2", 6'3", and he gave me one of those Russian bear hugs, and I was a little more slender in those days. It felt crack, kind of like my bones were cracking. And he looked down at me and he said, just after the meeting tonight, I met with a group of Russian academics, and we thought about the Bible. We had never considered the Bible before. And he said, I am the Russian general that led the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And he said, do you know something, Dr. Finley? He said, seeing what you said tonight in the Bible, it's difficult for me to understand that the Bible could not be inspired. Its prophecies are so clear. And then he made this comment. He said, we as a nation are morally bankrupt, but we know that the Bible must have some substance, and it will point us forward to a new morality in the future. Dr. Hasel, as you have tramped around the Middle East, share with us anything else from Babylon or anything else from the days of Nebuchadnezzar that helps you to have a confirmation in your own mind as a biblical scholar that the Bible indeed is the Word of God.
Well, holding this brick, and thinking this is something that Daniel could have seen, where it was in the construction or whatever. I mean, that to me is about as close as you can get. Picking up a piece of pottery in the old city of Jerusalem, excavating that pottery, even at a site, being the first person to hold on to something like that in 3,000 years, finding a fingerprint on that pot, and thinking, who made this pot? Who placed their fingerprint on that? It's almost like reaching back and shaking somebody's hand and thinking, they weren't that much different than we are. They lived life. They experienced life. And yet, these were real people living in real places. You visit these places, and the history and God's providence through history just comes to life in amazing ways.
Yeah, the archaeology gives you a background of the culture, the time,
That's right.
the life, the essence of the people. And then when you look at what actually has taken place on the ground, and you compare that to Bible prophecy, it's impressive.
It's very impressive.
This
Incredible.
prophecy of Babylon goes on, though, and let's proceed
Sure,
in our program, and
sure.
we'll continue to go through this prophecy of Babylon. Dr. Hasel has shared with us the fact that Cyrus, on that single night, drying up the Euphrates River, came down underneath the gates through the dry riverbed, marched his armies down, came up inside the city. The two gates on the inner walls in the city, because you remember Babylon had outer walls and inner walls, the two walls on the inner city, the gates were not shut because the Babylonians were in this drunken feast, and the forces of Cyrus that marched down the riverbed went through these open gates exactly as the Bible predicted 150 years in advance, attacked on that one night, and God had written with his own finger on the wall, many, many tekel upharsin. Thou art weighed in the balances, and you are found wanting. Thy kingdom is given to the Medes and the Persians. And that night, the Babylonian kingdom fell. It lay in ruins for many, many years after the overthrow of the kingdom by Cyrus. And as it lay in ruins, in future years, the Bible's accuracy is again revealed. Because after the fall of Babylon, after the attack by Cyrus, the Medes and Persians ruled from about 539 BC, that's before Christ, to 331 BC. It was then that the Greeks attacked, and the Greeks overthrew the Medes and the Persians. Now, you remember the name of the mighty Greek ruler as Alexander the Great. Alexander and his Greek armies overthrew the Mede-Persian armies. Alexander's ambition was indeed to overthrow the Medes and Persians, but also to rebuild the nation of Babylon. Alexander the Great planned to rebuild the Temple Tower at Babylon and make it the city a provincial capital. Now, Alexander had the resources to do that, both the financial resources, and he had the armies to do it. Now, remember what the Bible predicted. The Bible predicted that Babylon would be overthrown, and Babylon would never be rebuilt as a city, as a capital city again. Now, for 2 months, 10,000 men, that is 10,000 Greek artisans and workmen, worked clearing away the debris from old Babylon. As these 10,000 men worked, their goal, rebuild the Tower of Babylon and rebuild a provincial city and provincial capital here at Babylon. It was at this time, though, that Alexander died and the entire project was abandoned. If history teaches us anything, it teaches us the reliability of prophecy. History is not a kaleidoscope of events. History is not a mishmash of happenings. But Bible prophecy is being fulfilled. Its destiny, the destiny of the world, is being fulfilled in the predictions of ancient Scripture. Yes, God predicted that Babylon would fall. In the height of the Babylonian Empire, it fell unexpectedly. It fell suddenly. It fell quickly. It fell almost miraculously in that one night in the attack of Cyrus. Cyrus did not rebuild Babylon. Alexander the Great tried to rebuild Babylon. And if there was anybody that could have rebuilt it, it would be Alexander. The Romans left it in ruins, and down through the centuries it remained in ruins. Isaiah 13, verse 19 says, Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Now remember, Sodom and Gomorrah were two cities that rebelled against God, lived lavish lives of immorality and greed and selfishness. Sodom and Gomorrah were overthrown, totally decimated. Fire came down from God out of heaven and destroyed them, never to be rebuilt again. Babylon was never, ever, ever to be rebuilt again. The Bible says in Isaiah 13, verse 20, it will, notice the word, never be inhabited. As a friend of mine says, never means never, because if never didn't mean never, it would mean something. And something is not never, and never is not something. Sometime is not never. Never is never because it's never. It will never be inhabited, the Bible says, nor will it be settled from generation to generation, nor will Arabs pitch their tents there, nor will shepherds make their sheepfolds there, but wild beasts of the desert will lie there, and their houses will be full of owls. That's exactly what has happened down through the centuries. Although Saddam Hussein built a palace outside the city walls of Babylon, those city walls are today in ruins. The city is in ruins. And if you travel there today, you'll see the fluttering of an owl. You'll see the moving of jackals. You'll see the cry of owls. You will hear the wailing of the animals and the wild beasts. But nobody has rebuilt that city. Nobody lives there today. Jeremiah 51:37, Babylon shall become a heap, a dwelling place for jackals. You can hear the jackals crying at night, an astonishment and a hissing without inhabitant. Babylon today is an astonishment. If King Nebuchadnezzar would be here today, he would be absolutely astonished. Here's this city with a 20-year food supply in the past, a city with the beautiful, pure waters of the river Euphrates running through it, a city that had walls 200 feet high, 10 miles around, a city larger than Rome, a city larger than Athens, a city that chariots could race abreast on the walls of that city. But today, devastation, today, disaster, today, destruction, today, it's in heaps, never rebuilt. World leaders have tried to do that, but indeed it is in ruins. A city of total destruction. Daniel 4, verse 30. The king speaks, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and the honor of my majesty? That is recorded in Daniel, the 4th chapter. And as we go to Daniel, the 4th chapter, it tells quite an incredible story. And the lessons of that story, although they're old, are ever new. The lessons of that story, although they're ancient, are ever present. The lessons of that story, although they were written for a past generation, speak with relevance. They speak with meaning to this generation. Daniel chapter 4 speaks to a society today, a society that is synthetic, a society of buildings that are erected by the hands of man that are glass and concrete and steel. A society of modern cities, a society of affluence and abundance, a society that's proud and arrogant. Here in Daniel, the 4th chapter, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And in the dream, he sees a great tree. And the tree spreads out over the earth. And the fowls of the air come to nest in the tree. And the beasts of the earth get their shade under the tree. And the nations of the earth get their food from the tree. Here is this great tree. And the king is wondering, what does this mean? Daniel chapter 4, verse 8. At the last, Daniel comes in before me. His name is Belshazzar. That's his Babylonian name. According to the name of my God, to him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream to him, saying, tell me, what does the dream mean? Because no secret is kept from you. And then Daniel speaks to the king, and he says, I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth. Its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens. Its leaves were lovely. Its fruit was abundant. And Daniel describes to Nebuchadnezzar the dream, and he says, then I saw a watcher and a holy one. And he said, chop down the tree, cut off its branches, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit, tell the beasts to get out from under it, the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump in its roots. Bind it with a band of iron and bronze. Here, Nebuchadnezzar in a dream, he saw a tree, a mighty tree, a tree where all the fowl of the air came and nested in it, a tree that grew strong and was known in all the earth. But then the watcher and the Holy One said, come and chop down the tree. And the tree was chopped down and it fell to the ground. Nebuchadnezzar said to Daniel, Daniel, what is the meaning of this dream? What is its significance? Daniel said, Nebuchadnezzar, you are this tree. Your empire will be chopped down, destroyed. But there'll be a band of iron and brass that will preserve the stump or the empire. Nebuchadnezzar was given by God a year to repent of his sins. He was given time by God to come to receive the mercy and the grace of God. Unless Nebuchadnezzar accepted God's plan for his life, his empire would be chopped down, and Nebuchadnezzar would lose his mind. The Bible says that Nebuchadnezzar rejected God's plan for his life, and he cried out, "Is not this great Babylon that I've built?" In other words, he cried out in arrogance and pride, "I am the builder of Babylon. It's my empire. Look what I've done. Look at these 200 temples. Look at this magnificent city." And the Bible says, verse 31, while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. They'll drive you from men. Your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field." In this very hour, the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men. He ate grass like an oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven till hair had grown like eagle's feathers. Notice what happens. In an instant, Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind. He thinks he's a beast. Who's that man out there in the field? Who's that crawling among the beasts? Who is that with the long beard and the long hair? Who is that that grunts and groans like an animal? Who is that with the long nails? Who is that who is so unclean and filthy? He looks like an animal. No, he's not an animal. He is the king of Babylon, the brilliant Nebuchadnezzar, the all-wise Nebuchadnezzar, the wealthy Nebuchadnezzar, the Nebuchadnezzar who at the snap of his fingers a command went forth and his servants catered to his every whim and wish, but now he's in a field, drooling at the mouth, grunting and groaning like an animal. In Dorland's Medical Dictionary, there's a disease that's called lycanthropic insanity. Lycanthropic insanity, according to Dorland's Medical Dictionary, comes on a person very quickly, very rapidly, very suddenly. In that disease, a person perceives he or she is an animal. They often perceive they're a cat. It comes very quickly. Nebuchadnezzar, in his arrogance and pride, lost his mind. For 7 years, he wandered among the beasts. At the end of the 7 years, the Bible says in Daniel 4, verse 34, at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar. Now here you have a passage in the Bible written by a Babylonian king. You have a passage in the Bible written by the ancient king of Babylon. Babylon had fallen. Nebuchadnezzar, rather, had fallen. Nebuchadnezzar had gone out and wandered like the beasts. But now Nebuchadnezzar says, I want to speak because I looked to the God of heaven and something happened to me. My life was changed and transformed. And Nebuchadnezzar says, I can't be still anymore. I must tell my story. At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven. My understanding returned to me. I blessed the Most High. I praised and honored him who lives forever and ever. For his, that is God's dominion, is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. This is a Babylonian king speaking. This is a king who has destroyed Jerusalem, God's people speaking. This is a king that has decimated and killed thousands speaking. But now, after wandering for 7 years in the wilderness, after losing his mind, he looks to heaven, and God restores his sanity. God restores him to the throne. Once again, the king has his sanity restored. Once again, he sits upon the throne. Once again, the king of Babylon has a scepter in his hand. Once again, he rules because he acknowledges that God's kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand. His kingdom is one of glory and power and majesty. What if Nebuchadnezzar could have met Saddam Hussein? In my mind's eye, I see an imaginary scene. I understand that that scene is only imaginary. Nebuchadnezzar meets Saddam Hussein, the one who was his hero. And Nebuchadnezzar says to Saddam, Saddam, Daniel 4, verse 31, let me tell you my story. While the word was still in my Nebuchadnezzar's mouth, a voice fell from heaven and said, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it's spoken, the kingdom's departed from you. Nebuchadnezzar, you'll be driven from men. Your dwelling shall be with beasts of the field. They'll make you eat grass like oxen. Nebuchadnezzar, 7 times the 7 years will pass over you until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he chooses. I imagine in my wildest imagination that someplace out in the sands of Iraq, Nebuchadnezzar meets Saddam. Oh, I know it's just an imaginary meeting. But what would Nebuchadnezzar have said to Saddam? He would have said, I too built Babylon. I too had a mighty nation. I ruled all of the Middle East. I turned my back on the God of heaven. But then I lost my throne and I lost my empire and I wandered among the beasts. Oh, Saddam, Saddam, learn the lessons of history. Learn the lessons of the past so that you do not have to repeat history and wander like a beast and have your empire collapse and be destroyed. I wonder tonight if there's a lesson for you and for me. I wonder today if there's a lesson that speaks from the life of Nebuchadnezzar and the life of Saddam Hussein to you and to me. Could it be that the ancient ruins of Babylon speak to us? Could it be that the ancient sands of time have lessons buried there uncovered for us? Could it be that any life that walks away from God, any life that is lived in rebellion against God, any life that's lived in arrogance and pride will one day end up in disaster and folly? Could it be that as the sun sets over the deserts of Iraq and ancient Babylon, that echoing and re-echoing down the corridors of time is a lesson for you and me, a lesson that speaks to us with relevance? The only way to live a life filled with meaning and abundance and happiness is to live a life of obedience and dependence on God. To live a life of faithfulness to the God of the universe. As we close our program today, would you like to bow your head as Dr. Hasel comes just now to pray? To pray that God will be near. That these will be more than lessons of history, but they will be lessons that grip our lives, indicating that the only way to have a life filled with abundance is to live a life committed to the God of the universe. Dr. Hasel, pray for us.
Our Lord God, you are a God who reigns over the entire universe that you have created. You're a God who is great, and yet a God who sent his only Son to die on the cross for our sins, who gave up all life that we might have eternal life. And today we want to ask that you would come into our lives, that you would mold us and shape us like clay to be the human beings that you want us to be, so that we might live a life in obedience, in humble submissiveness to you, that we someday might be able to live forever in your kingdom, a kingdom that will not end, a kingdom that will fill and grow as a huge mountain filling the entire earth forever, that we can reign with Jesus. In his name, amen.
Stay with us. Our next program, we journey to Israel, and there discover more truths from Bible prophecy.